Hello. In today's chalkboard video, I'm going to talk about low RPM and airspeed. Now this is a companion video to peak RPM and airspeed, in which we use the inertia ram formula to show you what peak RPM of an engine would be. In this one, I want to talk more about the low RPM and even the very low RPM, and how it is related to airspeed and things you need to be thinking about when you are building an engine. Now, in looking at RPM, you really need to think about airspeed. And what happens is, as the cycling of the motor goes faster and faster, your airspeed in the runner actually goes up with RPM. This is why you have engines that don't always do real well at low RPM, and once you hit a certain RPM, they take off and they run like a bandit. And that's really based on airspeed. So when you're thinking about RPM, really think about it in terms of airspeed. RPM is airspeed, airflow is horsepower. And as you keep thinking about those two things, you can see how a motor actually runs. Now, as we're making an engine bigger and bigger in the terms of airflow, we're going to bigger valves, we're going to a bigger CC in the cylinder head runner, we're talking about a bigger cross section in the intake, and all of those things will slow down the air, especially down here at lower RPM. So that's one of the reasons why engines only have a certain RPM band at which they work in. Now, if you pay attention to things, you can broaden that. If you don't, you can wind up with an engine that really only works well at peak, a very peaky engine, they call it. Well, that's because you needed to do something about airspeed below the peak, because it doesn't pick up until close to peak, you make power, and then it's done. And you don't really want that. You want an engine that's a little more flexible. And part of that is watching your cross section in the intake runner itself. Now, like I said, it's really about airspeed as to how you're crossing the valve. The goal of the runner is to get the air up to a certain point. Now, maximum RPM was about the limit that you hit when you can't get the airspeed any faster. Now, down here at the lower RPM, there are things you can do. Now, you can make this intake small enough in cross-section that it costs you airflow, and that'll cost you power at peak. But that will help you at low RPM. And that's, some of the intakes out there are designed specifically to do that and help you generate more either mid-range or low-end power by lowering the cross-section and increasing the airspeed in the runner. Now, one of the things you can do if you're really worried about more down here is, like we said about the peak, is a longer runner will help. So if the runner is longer, then even at lower RPM it helps, because it's trying to get the airspeed up, and that helps even below peak, because we're really concerned about airspeed. And so some of the things you can look at, you can decide what you want to do. Now, in general, when you're building a motor, basically what you want is a runner that's just big enough to supply the cylinder head. And so that ensures that you have as much airspeed as you can pull off at whatever RPM that it starts to do well at, but it has enough airflow that you're making the horsepower that you're actually wanting to do, and not using a head that's way bigger. So one of your goals is to try and find an intake that's just the right size for what you're doing. Now, in small block Chevy world, there's a lot of choices. There's a lot of intakes out there. And that's partly why there's a lot of intakes, and there's guys that will swear by each and every one of them. And some of that is because it fits their specific application better, as to maintaining airflow and having the airspeed they need to run better down here. And that's the idea behind certain intakes. I mean, if you look at Edelbrock, you have a Victor Jr., you have a Victor, you have a Super Victor. Well, if we didn't care about airspeed, everybody could just run the big Super Victor and call it a day. But that doesn't work well. If you match the flow of the intake to what the engine is doing, it works really well. And so you need to choose the size according to what you're doing. Now, I wish that more intakes were flow tested by themselves so that we had flow numbers of what the intake flows all by itself, because that would help us choose better with one that matches the head that we're going to run. And that would help maintain the airflow and the airspeed that we need to have the engine run well. Now, a lot of the dyno testing you see done out there, that's really what they're doing. I call it the airspeed game, is sometimes they're swapping around intakes and trying to find one that's better. Well, that's better for that particular cam, that particular head, that particular airflow. And so they behave differently depending on what the airspeed is in the motor. And a prime example of that would be the Bulldog intake for the Cadillac engine. Now, this particular intake is a single plane with lots of taper, short runner, big cross section. And if you watch my videos on a lot of the intakes, I talk about what they flow, because I flow test a lot of the intakes to see where I'm sitting. In this case, this flows 360 CFM, just the intake. And so if you put it on a head, like a stock iron head, that only flows about 300 CFM, you're going to have some problems at the low RPM because the airspeed through the intake isn't very good. And so that really gives you trouble. You don't have a lot of high RPM power because you haven't really designed the engine for that. And the intake is really not, like they say, set up for that RPM. Yet if you put this intake on a boogeyman head, a as-cast boogeyman head, like we did with Richard Holdner in his videos, you will find out that this thing just runs like a bandit. This thing runs really good. Well, that's because the head flow is 360 CFM and the intake flow is 360 CFM. Now, the engine is higher RPM. It has a bigger cam, it has a bigger valve, it has a bigger head, and the intake is bigger. Well, that RPM helped bring up the airspeed, but by matching them across the whole thing to where RPM and the airspeed in the intake and the airspeed in the head is all working together, things run really well. And that's one of the things you want to look at. That's the same idea I had on this intake, which stirred a lot of controversy. Now again, there's a video on just this intake. This is a 368 intake that I modified for use on the 500 cubic inch motor. It has a very small cross section. Now, the idea behind it was using this same idea about airspeed. And this is for a stock head. You know, a stock head is only going to be using, especially with a stock cam, about 180 CFM. And that's about what this flows. And by matching those two things, it behaves itself very well. The runner in this thing, they tried to make a little more equal length by kind of jogging around. And as compared to a stock cast iron intake, it has a little better plenum design. Now I know most of you are thinking, well, that's open plenum, that's a single plane, that's really a high RPM. But because the runners are matched to what the head does, it's not really higher RPM. And that was all about in the formula that we had on the previous video. But this ran really well because it maintained airspeed in the runner at lower RPM. So though it really isn't going to change peak, because peak power, especially the horsepower you're going to make at peak, is really controlled by the cylinder head flow. And like I said, in this case, it's all stock. We're only using about 180 CFM. And so the intake isn't going to help you at peak. But by driving up the airspeed with a smaller cross section at lower RPM, we get a better mid-range punch out of it. So instead of having a curve that's just up here, it may pull out better up here and give you a little more power right in the middle of the power curve. That's a better behaved intake. Now, in the case of a single plane, the part of it is also about carburetor size. Like I've said before, you can start the airspeed up here. So in the case of a single plane that may be too big, like the Bulldog, or if you run the 1474 intake, the big tall tonal ram single carburetor intake for the Cadillac, well, that particular intake is got a fairly good cross section. I haven't flow tested one, partly because I don't think my bench goes high enough. I'm pretty sure that intake flows about 500 CFM. Now you put that on a regular cast iron head that even if you port it really well, is probably only going to flow about 320 CFM. Well, you're going to have some run problems. And so one of the things you can do is try and drive up the airspeed of the carburetor. And we'll talk more about that in the next video, where I talk about trying to solve problems with airspeed. Now, in choosing your stuff, you need to try and size it as best you can. Don't pick the really big intake just because it's cool. If you look, a lot of intakes, you can look at the cross section, you can kind of get an idea how big it is and see whether or not it's going to work for you, even without flow testing it. And if anything, if it's more of a driver, you want to err probably on the smaller side of the intake rather than the larger side of the intake. Hopefully it won't cost you too much in peak, and it'll give you a little better mid-range. So, like I said, when you're thinking about any RPM and what's going on with your engine, think about airspeed, because RPM is really airspeed. It's about what happens at airspeed. That's why as you go up in RPM, things can start running better and better. Now, I have talked about quality in port flowing, and that's important too. Occasionally, you see an engine that kind of peaks out, but then kind of crashes, and it gets real ugly up here at the top, and it doesn't carry well. Well, that's usually an indication that you have poor quality airflow, because remember, that's about the flow over the valve at closing. Now, if that's not very good, if the port's not very well designed, it can start crashing and you start having problems and you get funny indications at peak. By fixing that, you can sometimes get a better peak. It'll sometimes even carry further. It was actually the RPM it was meant to go to, but you just couldn't get there because the air was crashing. And this is one of the things that a good porter will do for you. A guy that's porting ahead will give you a better quality port. And this is why I keep saying you can't just make things bigger. You can't just go to the really big intake. You can't go to just the really big head. Not only because that's going to push you up in RPM, but because that's going to reduce the airspeed at lower RPM, and it's going to give you a very lazy port. And that's why porters look at some of this. Now, some of the times when they say lazy port, it's because they're looking at particular airspeeds on the flow bench. But what they're really doing is equalizing out the port to where it doesn't have super high-speed ports, it doesn't crash, the air isn't coming over and hitting the wall. Those are things that are important in order to help your engine run well at peak RPM and help run at lower RPM smoothly. Now, I always laugh when people test heads. Well, I'm going to test this 180cc port against this 200cc or 210cc port, and we'll see which one does better at low R, because it's supposed to do better. Well, this is the high-speed part of the system. So that's really not going to change things a whole lot. You could actually go a little big on the port as long as you're paying better attention on the intake. But your biggest mistake would be to go too big on the intake. And that's when things really don't run well, because you really need to try and maintain a decent airspeed. And a lot of times when I see things running or not doing well, that's because I can see that it's airspeed related. I need to do something to drive up the airspeed. And in the next video, I'm going to talk more about what you can do to fix an engine that's having trouble or an intake that's not quite right in order to try and make it run better for you. In this video, I'm just trying to convince you to look at the parts you're buying and try and make sure they match what you're doing. In the case of the Cadillac, you don't want the real big tunnel ram looking intake if you're running a iron head. You probably want to run the Adelbrock dual plane intake and be in a more sensible range where the intake's going to behave itself well. Even with this Bulldog intake, you either need it on a all-out ported, you got everything out of the cast iron head you could, or you want it on an as-cast boogeyman head, because that's more in the flow range of what the intake is going to work at. And the same with the really big is we're trying to get even more flow out of the boogeyman head to make really good use of the bigger intake that Potter designed. And that's really how you want to figure out this stuff, is one piece has to kind of match what the other piece is doing. And I try real hard to match intakes to kind of what the flow of the head is doing. And that's the same thing I do if you watch my video on picking carburetor size. It's picking a carburetor size based on the flow of what the heads do. And that makes sure everything's kind of pulling together to maintain a decent airspeed. Now, as you enlarge the runner, you are going to lose low end power. There's just no way around it, because you are not going to have the airspeed you need. You can't have everything. But you don't want to make it to where it's just working at peak. You want to try and get as much pull down here as you can out of the engine, and by paying attention to the parts you're picking, it can do that. And some intakes that we've kind of forgotten about, that was their purpose in mind. If you look at like a Torquer 2 intake, well, that's a straight runner. It's not got taper in it, so it's a longer runner, but it's a single plane and it's a smaller cross section. The idea was with a regular cast iron small block Chevy head, you could have a single plane, which would give you a little bit more because of how the carburetor behaves, but it's still a lower cross section, so you're not losing all of that low end torque because it can maintain airspeed in the runner. And that was the idea behind that intake, and we've kind of forgotten about that. Most of the time now, people run a Victor Jr. Now, in small block Chevy world, part of the problem is as heads have gotten better and better, we have more and more flow, which means we need bigger and bigger intakes in order to keep up with the flow of the cylinder head. And so you've got this balancing act that you're trying to do. And I call this the airspeed game. You're trying to find that sweet spot between where you have enough flow to really make the horsepower and enough airspeed to really do well further down in the RPM range. And so that's lower RPM and airspeed, and it's something you need to think about. Now, in the next video, I'm going to talk about things you can do to fix an airspeed problem if you have it, because I've run across a few things. Now, I know most of you guys aren't going to design intakes or do really serious stuff, but some of it will give you an understanding of how you can use airspeed when you're thinking about it to fix something that's not running quite right. So I wish you all luck on your projects, and I'll talk to you in the next video. And like I said, it should be about using airspeed to fix problems. So I'll see you then. Bye.